Go straight on. Keep right, and then turn right. Turn right.
The threat to the free press, it was really an omen of the threat to free speech. Extraordinary that in his UN speech that he would endorse the idea of free speech because his policies are not in line with the idea of free speech.
And you know, Terry, the passage you read, it doesn't sound like Donald Trump. That is something a speechwriter wrote on a teleprompter that he managed to read. But it's at odds with what he says in unguarded moments, and he doesn't seem to know, unlike Brendan Carr, the FCC chairman, who at least tries to, veil the threat. The Trump threat is unveiled, and we have this phenomenon now of a sitting president of the United States suing and we've sort of gotten used to that, but that's a normal thing. But that's a preposterous thing. The leader of the United States thinks that rather than respond to speech with his own set of reasons and policies and, engagement in debate, it's a different era entirely.
Adam, you had paraphrased what Trump wrote on Truth Social, his social media platform. So let me read it. He wrote, "I can't believe ABC fake news gave Jimmy Kimmel his job back. The White House was told by ABC that his show was canceled. Something happened between then and now because his audience is gone, capital letters, and his talent, in quotes, was never there. Why would they want somebody back who does so poorly, who's not funny, and who puts the network in jeopardy by playing 90% positive Democrat marketing? He's yet another arm of the DNC, and to the best of my knowledge, that would be a major illegal campaign contribution. I think we're going to test ABC out on this. Let's see how we do. Last time I went after them, they gave me $16 million. This one sounds even more lucrative. A true bunch of losers. Let Jimmy Kimmel rot at his bad rating." Adam, do you want to break down what you make of that?
I mean, every part of it is disturbing and unseemly. The notion that he can sue Kimmel for a joke, and this idea that political commentary is a campaign contribution is, entirely at odds with the law. It's hard to know what to make of it, except that it's sort of an incoherent rant.
But it says that this story isn't over.
Oh,
That, victory has not been won by Jimmy Kimmel just because he's back on the air. That's a very partial victory for him. If Trump intends to go after him or ABC and sue for even more money than $16 million.
yes, I mean, Trump is at war with not only the press, but even with comedians who make jokes at his expense. I mean, it's beyond unseemly, and it's wholly at odds with the American conception of free speech.
So I want to mention in this context that Brendan Carr wrote the chapter in the Heritage Foundation's 2025 project, which has become a blueprint for the Trump administration. He wrote the chapter on the FCC. Do you have any comment about the fact that he was chosen to write this conservative blueprint?
Well, I think it's just following the playbook that he himself wrote. See that playing out now? And he...
Following the playbook that he wrote in Project 2025?
Absolutely. He wrote it, and now he's putting it into practice. And these are, without question, authoritarian measures. I mean, that he's going to decide what's fair. He's going to decide what commentary is permitted. He's going to decide what coverage is supposedly biased. And clearly he's going to suggest bias on the part of anything that's critical of Donald Trump, as opposed to anything that's critical of the Democrats. That's going to be his target, is going to be anything that's critical of this is not his role, and it's yet another step toward authoritarianism.
If you're just joining us, my guests are Marty Barron, former editor of the Washington Post, who's now on the steering committee of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and Adam Liptak, who covers the courts and legal issues for the New York Times. He previously worked as a lawyer representing the Times. We'll talk about this and other First Amendment issues during President Trump's second term. I'm Terry Gross, and this is Fresh Air.
Supports WHYY's Fresh Air and its commitment to sharing ideas and encouraging meaningful conversation. Support for NPR comes from this station and from Ooma, a cloud-based phone service for any size business with an automated virtual receptionist, video meetings, and other features to connect to customers and coworkers anywhere at ooma.com/NPR. And from BritBox, committed to helping viewers to see it differently with British TV, with new original series like Code of Silence about a deaf woman recruited as a lip reader in a high-stakes police investigation. Streaming at BritBox.com.
This is Public Radio Tulsa's Judith Knoll. We're living in a moment that is unprecedented in my lifetime, one in which First Amendment rights are being curtailed, in which facts are regularly denied, and in which large media organizations bow to government pressure to silence critics. This is a moment in which access to free, fair, and impartial journalism has never been more important, but when reliable commercial news sources like newspapers are shutting their doors. This is the journalistic landscape in which public radio stations like this one find themselves, needed more than ever and more reliant than ever on listener support to stay alive. Help make sure Public Radio Tulsa and NPR can keep serving Northeast Oklahoma with fact-centered reporting. Become a contributing listener by clicking the red donate button at publicradiotulsa.org.
This is Fresh Air. Let's get back to my interview with Marty Barron and Adam Liptak. Barron is the former editor of the Washington Post and is now on the steering committee of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Adam Liptak covers reports for the New York Times. He's also a lawyer who previously represented the Times. We're talking about the First Amendment and freedom of the press and what they mean now in President Trump's second term. So now that we know what Jimmy Kimmel had to say on his show, let's talk about the FCC's role in this story. And I want to start with two clips from FCC Commissioner. Now, he's the chair of the Federal Communications Commission. And first I want to play what he had to say after the Kimmel broadcast that created all this controversy. So here's Brendan Carr.
I've been very clear. From the moment that I had become chairman of the FCC, I want to reinvigorate the public interest. And what people don't understand is that the broadcasters, if you've got this right, are entirely different than people that use other forms of communication. They have a license granted by us at the FCC, and that comes with it an obligation to operate in the public interest. And we can get into some ways that we've been trying to reinvigorate the public interest and some changes that we've seen. But frankly, when we see stuff like this, I mean, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead.
So that was the chair of the FCC, Brendan Carr, who was speaking to Benny Johnson. Benny Johnson is a right-wing podcaster. So let's hear what he had to say Monday. This was at the Concordia Annual Summit in New York City.
What happens at the FCC is when you have a broadcast license, there's conditions, there's a public interest standard, which means you have to operate consistent with the public interest. And one of the things that the FCC has in our case law and our precedent is this concept of a news distortion complaint. What I spoke about last week was that when concerns are raised about news distortion, there's an easy way for parties to address that and work that out. And in the main, that takes place between local television stations that are licensed by the FCC and what we call national programmers like this. They work that out, and there doesn't need to be any involvement of the FCC. Now, if they don't, there's a way that's not as easy, which is someone can file a complaint at the FCC, and then the FCC, by law, as set up by Congress, has to adjudicate that complaint. And what I've been very clear in the context of the Kimmel episode is the FCC, and myself in particular, have expressed no view on the ultimate merits had something like that been filed. What our take would be one way or the other.
Okay, so in the first clip, he was talking about changing Jimmy Kimmel's conduct. He was talking about Kimmel's conduct on the show. And in the second clip, he's saying, I was just referring to like the process that the FCC goes through. You can work it out among, Kimmel and Disney, or you could do it the hard way and work it out through the FCC. And he was talking about news distortion. So how do you interpret these two separate clips? And do you see him as just clarifying what he had to say? Because he said that Democrats had distorted what he was saying the first time around. So do you see this as a clarification or as a walking back?
Well, I think it's really neither. I think what he said at the beginning was clearly a threat. I think it's also important to remember that how Trump was able to extract a settlement from Paramount when it was trying to execute its merger with Skydance. Paramount, of course, was the owner of CBS, and now Skydance is. But I don't know law normally applied to false advertising, and he was seeking this sum of $20 billion, a absurd sum over how 60 Minutes had ended the campaign interview with Kamala Harris. And what happened then was that about the same time, the conservative group filed a complaint with the FCC alleging news distortion along the very same line Trump alleged in his private litigation. And so what Carr did in those circumstances was that he said that he'd take up that complaint from the conservative group, and he'd take that into consideration in deciding with the Paramount Skydance merger. And in that way, he was able to say he wasn't responding to Trump's lawsuit, he wasn't working on behalf of Trump, he was simply responding to a complaint from this conservative group. But it's not difficult to imagine that there's some level of coordination, or at least like-minded thinking, that
Keep
these things are all
left,
happening
and
at the
then
same
turn
time,
left.
and it gives Carr deniability that he's really responding to pressure from Donald Trump, and it allows him to say
Turn left.
just responding to a complaint that was filed with the FCC under the normal rules.
There is a line of Supreme Court precedent here that's quite relevant that says the government and the president has a bully pulpit and its policies are the right ones. But what it's not permitted to do is to use coercion backed by threats that the government, regulation or otherwise, will punish you if you don't do what it wants. And these Carr statements at least bump up next to that line. The Supreme Court in 1963, in a case called Bantam Books, said that a Rhode Island commission concerned about indecent books could not lean on a book distributor and say, you know, you'd be better off, we'd hate to refer you to a prosecutor if you might want to blacklist the following books. And the Supreme Court says that violates the First Amendment, that leaning on an intermediary to try to suppress the speech of somebody else violates the First Amendment. And just last year, and unanimously, the Supreme Court said that the NRA's free speech rights were jeopardized when a New York insurance commissioner, after the Parkland school shooting, urged insurance companies not to do business with the NRA. And the Supreme Court again says that kind of coercion, that use of regulatory power rather than persuasion, coercion, violates the First Amendment. And that maps on to pretty plainly what we're seeing.
So the Pentagon has announced a new policy that if you are a Pentagon reporter, you have to take a pledge. Marty, do you want to
Go straight
describe
on.
what the pledge is?
Well, essentially, the pledge is that anybody who's covering the Pentagon has to pledge that they will not collect or distribute, disseminate any information that wasn't officially released by the Department of Defense. And so that's whether it's classified or unclassified, it doesn't matter. So that's the policy. And now news organizations have to decide whether they're going to sign that sort of pledge. I would argue that they definitively should not sign such a pledge, and that they should work together in all deciding not to sign that pledge.
Why would you say definitively they should not sign the pledge?
Well, I mean, basically what the Department of Defense is now asking of journalists is that they convert themselves into extensions of the Public Relations Department, that they not perform as journalists, independent journalists, that they essentially, I think any journalist who would sign such a pledge instantly becomes something else entirely. They become a propagandist for the Department of Defense. So there's a big difference between being just an outfit that disseminates press releases from the Department of Defense and being a journalist who covers it with full independence.
Adam, what would you say about First Amendment issues in terms of this pledge and, freedom of the press?
I mean, it's preposterous. It's laughable. It's a plain violation of the First Amendment. And as Marty says, it's a non-starter. I mean, no serious journalist would consider signing a thing, and if you did sign a thing, you would no longer be a serious journalist or any kind of journalist.
So, you know, President Trump has filed multiple lawsuits against newspapers, TV networks, CBS, ABC, and he has settled out of court with CBS and ABC, although he says he won, meaning that he won in court. It was settled out of court. But they each paid like $16 million. How do you interpret that, standing outside of this? Do you see them as having caved to Trump or just avoided worse nightmares? Like, do you have an interpretation?
I think they caved. They clearly feared Trump's power. An ABC settlement came before Trump actually took office, but they feared what the consequences would be once he did take office. The agreement by Paramount regarding Trump's allegations against CBS were because they felt they needed to execute a merger with Skydance. And they wanted to execute that merger, and it was clear to them that that merger would not go through unless they reached an agreement. And sure enough, as soon as they reached that agreement of paying $16 billion, which reportedly is going to the Trump library, the agreement was struck, the merger was approved. But it also came with a side deal. Trump himself
Go straight on.
in order to execute that merger, Paramount felt that it needed to reach this agreement, and Skydance felt that it needed to meet its agreement to provide this so-called public service advertising. And by the way, it also agreed to have a so-called ombudsman, and it has now named that ombudsman, who came from
Keep
a
right
very conservative,
and then
far-right
turn
organization
right.
called Hudson Institute, someone who doesn't really have experience in journalism
Turn
at
right.
all, and he will now be the ombudsman at CBS.
These lawsuits were, one of them, the ABC lawsuit, very weak. The other, the CBS lawsuit, laughable, preposterous. And not long ago, no serious news organization would have contemplated settling either lawsuit. So it's hard to interpret it as anything other than caving to pressure, or it's not hard to understand it as a kind of a bribe to pay the President of the United States money when you have business before the federal government.
Well, let me reintroduce you both. If you're just joining us, my guests are Adam Liptak, who covers the courts for the New York Times. He's also a lawyer who previously represented the Times. Also with us is Marty Barron, the former editor of the Washington Post, who's
Go
now on the
straight on.
steering committee of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. We'll be right back. This is Fresh Air.
Singer and fiddle player Amanda Shires had long collaborated with her husband, fellow Nashville star Jason Isbell. Her new album processes their divorce in a series of raw, honest
Go
songs.
straight on.
After the aftermath, you know, you can find freedom, and then now I realize I don't belong to anybody but myself.
Amanda Shires on her new album Nobody's Girl, on the next All Things Considered from NPR News.
Join us this afternoon at 4 on Public Radio 89.5.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from
Keep left
Viking, committed
and
to
then turn
exploring the
left.
world in comfort, offering small ship experiences with a shore excursion included in every port and
left.
programs designed for cultural enrichment. Learn more at Viking.com. And from Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Since 1946, AU has supported the First Amendment right to religion. More at au.org.
Let me reintroduce my guests if you're just joining us. Marty Barron is the former editor of the Washington Post. He's currently on the steering committee of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Adam Liptak covers the courts for the New York Times. He's also a lawyer who previously represented the Times. We're talking about what the First Amendment and freedom of the press mean now in President Trump's second term. So, Trump has sued the New York Times 3 times. The first 2 were thrown out. The third, a decision was reached last week. It's not a final decision. Adam, you used to be the New York Times lawyer. You've done a lot of First Amendment cases. Tell us about what the suit is and what the judge's comments were.
Well, it dignifies it to call it a suit. It's a screed. It's a rant with a legal caption on it. And
It's officially a defamation suit.
Yes, it seems the president thinks the Times defamed him by not giving him enough credit for his business acumen. And in a telling development, federal judge in Florida, Republican appointee, threw out, provisionally, they can refile, but threw out the lawsuit for being a violation of the fundamental rule in civil procedure that when you sue somebody, you should, in plain and short terms, say what was false and what your claim is. And he said this document that the president's lawyers filed, failed that basic test that every lawyer should know.
I thought this lawsuit which was for $15 billion, by the way. And it's hard to see any damages that Trump has suffered. As he himself says in that lawsuit, he won the election with a wide margin of electoral votes, and calls it he likes to call it a landslide. And on page 10 of that lawsuit, Trump's lawyers, they assert his, as they call it, his sui generis charisma, his singular brilliance, his unique business acumen, and suggest later that he single-mindedly revolutionized the television business. And, anyone who looks in the mirror in the morning and marvels at himself that way, I think would naturally view anything less flattering as defamation. And I think the federal judge who dismissed the lawsuit provisionally, he was correct in calling it just that lawsuit mostly invective and mostly public relations.
Can I just read a couple of excerpts of the judge's writing? Because it really reads like a book critic's review of a terrible book. The judge says that the complaint was unnecessarily lengthy and digressive. He criticized Trump's lawyers for waiting until page 80 to lodge a formal allegation of defamation, and for including ahead of it dozens of, quote, florid and enervating pages, lavishing praise on the president and enumerating a range of grievances. I actually looked up enervating. I know the word, I read it in context, but I never knew exactly what it meant. So it means to reduce your strength or mental vigor. So that's what he's accusing the writing here of doing. And the judge goes on to say, a complaint is not a public forum for vituperation and invective. It's not a protected platform to rage against an... The judge threw it out, calling it improper and impermissible in its present form. So it gave Trump's lawyers 28 days to resubmit. Adam, any speculation about what will happen?
There will be an attempt to satisfy the judge and satisfy the client, and that's going to be hard to navigate.
All right. Check 1, 2. Inky, pinky, ponky, wonky, wonky.
Drive safe. Ready to turn right. Turn right. Let's do this. Turn right. Mind? I'll find a new route. Time to hit the road. ready to roll. Turn left. Okay, here we go. Okay, let's find a new route.
Bye.